All right, so we're on week 3, the second week of ecology, though. So this week we're looking at population growth patterns. So we're going to cover two major types of growth patterns. We're going to look at exponential growth and logistic growth. And we'll kind of go through the basics of each, what type of species follow each type of pattern. And we're also going to spend some time comparing it to COVID-19 because we can see some of these same growth patterns in our data from the virus. Keep in mind while you watch this video, you're going to want to have the notes page up in a second window so that you can type in the notes for that assignment as you listen along. One suggestion I might have is I am going to pause a couple seconds at the end of each slide before I move on. So if you want to listen to all the information on the slide and then pause your video to go back and type in the notes, you can do that. And I'll leave that little lag time at the end for you to pause between each slide. So first, let's look at exponential growth. So exponential growth produces a J-shaped curve. You can kind of see over here, it starts off pretty slow and then it goes pretty steeply up and sharp. It has two main phases. The first phase is lag phase, and that's when the growth is slow because the population is small. So this would be when I think of like mosquitoes in Michigan right now. We're in the lag phase. We just have some adult mosquitoes that have moved into the area and they're starting to get together and reproduce. And we have a pretty low population, but after a couple rains and those few mosquitoes reproduce, thousands each, we're going to see a massive upshoot, and that's called the exponential growth phase. And that's when growth rapidly accelerates. So again, exponential looks like a J. We have a lag phase where things are pretty slow but upticking. And then exponential, you see this massive uptick with a pretty sharp slope going up. Okay, we can kind of compare this to COVID-19, especially in the United States. In January and February, we had our first cases of COVID-19 detected in the United States, but they were very minusculely small. Okay? Then we hit March, and we have all these few small population cases, and then those few people started to infect a lot of people. And we saw a massive exponential growth curve happen. You can almost kind of picture like about right here is when we finished school on March 12th. And then there was a massive explosion right after that because we had this small lag time where people were infected, but it was such a small amount, but they were able to infect so many, we saw a massive spike. You can see this data is a little bit old. It goes to March 26th. And right now in the United States, for example, we have over 100,000 confirmed cases at this point that have been tested. But you still see this huge exponential growth rate. So when you think of us staying home in March and April, that is to hopefully slow that exponential growth rate. China hit their exponential growth much sooner. So they saw this massive uptick of exponential growth in January into early February. And then it started to decelerate and hit kind of its maximum capacity. And they still have cases, but they're not seeing the exponential growth that we are still. So in species, there are some certain characteristics that typically are in place for species that show exponential growth. So it's common for a species that moves into a new area. So an invasive species comes in, only a couple need to enter that ecosystem, they breed, their offspring breed, and you continue and you see this exponential growth of that species. So exponential growth will occur in a new area. It'll also occur for a species that reproduces in large numbers and then die off all at once as resources are depleted. So you see this with like mosquitoes and rabbits. You have this massive boom of a ton of offspring all in the spring, and then you kind of start to see them become depleted when there's not enough resources or there's too many predators, etc. And we'll talk about in our next type of growth what happens when it starts to level off like that. But with exponential, it just continues to boom. So we call these R-selected species. And we also sometimes call them boom or bust species. So they have this massive boom, and then usually they hit a busting point where there's not enough resources, or maybe the environment can no longer support their needs, and you see a massive bust where it comes down. So our selective species, or species that typically grow exponentially, tend to be small and have short lifespans. They also tend to be fast to mature and produce many offspring. Mosquitoes are a great example of this, again, where 2 mosquitoes could mate and produce thousands of offspring from one mating. They also produce little to no parental care. So again, so many offspring, they might provide a small amount, but then once they get going, the offspring are on their own. So some examples are mice, rabbits, weeds, and bacteria. So again, exponential massive boom, and you see it increasing to no end. Second type of growth is logistic. So exponential growth had that J shape. Logistic has a sigmoidal or an S-shaped curve. It has 4 phases, and it starts out exactly the same as exponential growth. So the first phase is lag phase. So you see this time where there's a very small amount of growth happening in a very small population size. Then exponential growth does get into an exponential growth phase, where literally it shoots up and you see this exponential boom. But unlike exponential growth that just keeps going, logistic growth has 2 more phases. First, there's a deceleration. So that is where growth slows. You're not going to see it like totally drop back down for deceleration, but you're going to see the curve and the amount of growth start to slow. And so it's going to start to curve more than having a sharp slope coming up. And then you're going to hit something called equilibrium. And equilibrium is where there's little to no growth because birth and death rates become about equal. So it's kind of what we call a carrying capacity, where you hit the point where the environment can support enough of that population. There's enough resources, space, everything it needs. And the population isn't massively spiking, but it's also not dropping necessarily. So we've hit that carrying capacity, and that happens when the population reaches the maximum number of individuals a given species that a community can support. So with logistic growth, we start out the same. We have lag growth and then exponential, but then we decelerate and we hit that equilibrium of carrying capacity of how many individuals can that population actually support comfortably. We can compare this a little bit to COVID-19 as well. So this is a graphic from the CDC. When we think of carrying capacity with COVID-19, we think about the carrying capacity of our healthcare system. With our current hospital and healthcare systems, how many individuals can we safely and effectively treat who need assistance when battling COVID-19? So that's kind of the carrying capacity line right here. And when we talk about flattening the curve, we want to keep that exponential growth underneath our health system carrying capacity. So when you think about social distancing and wearing masks and being protective with ourselves and flattening the curve, we don't want that exponential growth to just continue to rise past our health system's carrying capacity. We want to flatten that curve so that the exponential growth decelerates before we hit that max capacity that our healthcare system can handle. And in most states and cities, we're shooting for that. Okay? When you think of Kent County, we have a rise right now of cases happening. However, right now it's within our healthcare's capacity to deal with those cases. As opposed to you look at New York and Detroit, where that curve and that exponential growth has exceeded their carrying capacity and ability to treat. And you see some of that panic mode set in when they don't have enough beds or ventilators or protective equipment for doctors because they're starting to exceed that carrying capacity. So the goal is to keep that exponential growth low enough and that we hit that equilibrium and then start to go back down by doing some of those social distancing measures. So with species, what does this look like? What kind of species would undergo logistic growth as opposed to exponential? So we call these K-selected species. It's usually pretty much the opposite of your exponential or R-selected species. So these ones tend to be larger individuals that have longer lifespans. They are also slow to mature and typically produce few offspring. They provide lots of care to the offspring to ensure their survival. Humans are a perfect example of this, so are elephants and horses. And so things that are slow to increase their population size and then they kind of max out would be your K-selected species. So here's kind of a nice just graph comparing the two. So your K-selected or your logistic growth species, they have that exponential phase, but then they plateau out. Ignore the fact that that is misspelled with a K. Your R-selected species have that boom or bust where there's a massive exponential growth phase, and then they kind of crash because the ecosystem can't support that many. Or maybe the weather changes and it doesn't support their needs anymore, and you have this massive bust. Okay, so there's two other things that can affect that population growth size. So first are density independent factors, and that's when the effect does not increase or decrease with population density. So these are things that will keep a population's growth in check, but it doesn't matter if it's a huge population or a small. So random events like pollution, drought, freezes, hurricanes, forest fires, all your natural disasters, they're not going to be picky about the population size or growth that they're wiping out or affecting. It's completely by chance. So it doesn't matter how big or small the population is. Density independent factors won't affect things differently based on their size. Density dependent, so it does depend on density factors, are when the percentage of the population affected increases as the density of the population increases. So these are factors that will affect a population and will affect it more as the population gets bigger. So a good example of this is competition. When members of a species compete to use the same resources that are in limited supply. So if you see a population of something increase, you're going to start to have to compete for resources as they run out with other individuals of that same population. Also predation. When more prey is available, predation increases. So we're actually seeing this in Walker, Michigan right now. So when we had this massive decrease of the number of car accidents between cars and some of our local species like raccoons and rabbits and deer, we are now seeing a massive influx of some of our predator populations. So we're seeing coyotes come into areas where they don't typically exist or don't typically hang out because we're seeing the prey increase in those areas because people are less likely to be there because everybody is mostly inside. So as prey increases, predation increases. So you see that also start to affect population sizes. Also disease. I mean, this is perfect for talking about COVID-19. It spreads more quickly when the population is denser. So when people are closer together in large groups, together intermingling with groups they don't normally mingle with, you see that disease able to spread a lot faster. This is also perfect when you think about COVID-19 and who's been hit the hardest in some ways, because it tends to be those denser, more tightly packed cities where people live closer together and spend a lot of time maybe on public transportation or in public spaces together. They tended to have a lot more spread of COVID-19 really rapidly and exponentially than some of the cities where people are more spaced out and they have more room and aren't coming into contact with each other as quickly. We also see parasitism play a role in population size. So parasites can bring a population down, and also migration, moving to a new area. So what do you need to do this week? So first, you did the first step. Watch this video and submit your notes you took with it. Second, take the practice quiz over the stuff in the video. And then go back and look through your grades on Canvas. I didn't put another activity out this week because I have quite a few people who are just missing like one thing that I want you to go take care of. So there's some people who did everything for the last 3 weeks, except for like one quiz last week. There's quite a few people who missed just that quiz. I think you just didn't scroll down far enough to find it, or maybe you skipped over the activity last week and now you have time to go back and do it. But just double check you have everything done for my course on Canvas. And then do join a Google Meet on Tuesday or Wednesday at 11 o'clock. I do keep track of attendance for those and put that into Canvas for you so that people know that you are engaging when they start to look at what you've done during distance learning. So attend either of those days. We'll play a review game, and I look forward to seeing you. Let me know if you have questions.